This is Kenya's the number one opera in the world, according to Thorin. You're watching Thorin channel, that are also known as the number one existence fan in the world.
News came out this week that Existence had been officially released from the G2 esports organisation, which for anyone who'd been following reports was in line with him and ScreaM, the former Envious player, coming forth and announcing a new team that they would be playing in, and crucially, an internationals team, not just a team made up of people from France or Belgium or the occasional Swiss guy like Maniac. So this new team has been formed. At the moment, they don't have an organisation or any sponsors, and so they're actually looking for those. In fact, ScreaM did a tweet where he basically said like an email address you could contact in order to potentially become their new organisation or sponsor. And actually, despite the fact it's a very mixed up lineup full of people who, quite frankly, a bunch of them are considered washed up or just not that good anymore, the name value of the team is actually somewhat impressive. And if you look at the team overall, depending on if certain circumstances come to fruition, there is some potential within the lineup. Now, apparently, it will initially compete under the tag Uruguay, but as I say, they're looking for an org, and they have taken the MDL spot of Red Reserve, because a couple of these players were in Red Reserve, and indeed the coach was the coach of Red Reserve, and the lineup is Draken, the former Fnatic and NIP player, Hampus, formerly of Red Reserve, ScreaM, obviously Envious, G2, Very Games, Titan, the G2 that was the international one, ScreaM, as I said, Existence, obviously most recently from G2, but before that, Titan, Very Games, LDLC, and HS, who you might remember was a player for Optic when they had the very mixed international lineup, Penta before that, and very briefly played, I think maybe in, I'm not sure if he actually played in Heroic, I forget. He played in some team after Optic. So let's start at the top here. The name to start with initially is obviously Existence, because this is someone who's going to be the in-game leader. This is someone who is a legendary in-game leader within the scene. So clearly, someone like that can have a massive impact on a team like this, their success. The types of players that you have in the team are going to be important depending on who the in-game leader is. So if you look at the G2 era, the last lineup that he was in the French scene, where it was him, Shox, Kenny S, Body and Smiths, first of all, I have to say, that team, yes, ultimately was very underwhelming by the end. And it had some high points, but their general day-to-day level was way lower than it should have been, and they never were able to really get their win conditions off the ground. Kenny S and Shox being good at the same time, actually having a great team play base, having very good tactical execution. They were never quite all the way there on any of those aspects. And so despite the occasional big upset, they genuinely were fairly underwhelming and generally were a disappointment, quite frankly. But I have to say, the part that does feel a bit unfair about judging Existence on that lineup is first and foremost that he had to have Smiths in the lineup. And that was a condition of Shox, who was the guy who had the connection with the Order, Ocelot from G2, and decided if he was going to bring Existence back, then he was going to bring Smiths, his old mate, back as well. So we can never know what that lineup would have been like with any other player than Smiths. I mean, you look at this guy Lucky that they brought in a G2 now, seems to have a little bit of potential. You obviously think in the past of people like Ziwu, who were obviously always on the horizon. Kiyashima was out in no man's land. There are plenty of good players out there who, if you had them instead of Smiths, at least we might have seen if some of these win conditions could come online, but we never did. Then you got to add in Kenny S, except for the first couple of tournaments, was his absolute career low playing under Existence. And that's not as simple as going, well, if you're Existence, why didn't you motivate him or whatever? No, Kenny S didn't even get it going again until very, very recently, actually, again. So this was just a lull in his career and the perfect storm of everything going badly on his end. So as a result, you never got Shox and Kenny S both going ham at the same time. You just had Shox towards the end being really good. You never had Shox and Kenny S but no Smiths. You always had them temper them. And Smiths was obviously, by the end, one of the worst fraggers in the pro scene. Existence himself, actually, not a bad fragger for an in-game leader overall. And so, even though I do think it was fair to cut Existence, like I thought actually he didn't assert himself as much as he should have done. He didn't go all out. In many ways, I would compare Existence's time in G2 to how I consider FNS's time in Cloud9, where I know the guy wasn't assertive enough, didn't force his system on people, was too much willing to compromise what he did, and by giving a finger, they take an arm. And as a result, at the end, you think, I never even fully got to implement my system. It's like, no one gives a shit, mate. You had your chance, you just let other people convince you not to do it, and therefore, at the end, you never feel like you fully got your crack at it, right? So when a team fails as badly as that, I'm not necessarily against it. I would have liked them to give one last chance and have a different player than Smith's lineup, but whatever. Like, I actually think the biggest problem that team had, beyond Smith's being really bad and Body being very underwhelming and Kennius and Shocks never being star players at the same time or overall, I think the biggest issue they had was actually the style of player they had. They lacked aggressive entry style players. Shocks basically had to do it himself by the end. And that's why actually I think it's a shame that they didn't have Lockie. I think he actually could have played that role and maybe made them a better team in terms of more dynamic. Like, they could have executed on some of those tactics. I actually think that this lineup now is what will show us the future existence, whether or not he is completely done or whether he has a future as an in-game leader and a player, because these are pretty much all players looking for some form of redemption. So the interesting detail is there is some talent here, there's even some experience here, but they're all players down on their luck. They're all trying to turn their careers around. They're all trying to become relevant, top international level players, either for the first time in the case of HS and Hampus, or again in the case of ScreaM, Existence, and Shocks. Draken, obviously. So, to me, this is a big chance for Existence to turn his career around, because obviously as the team goes, so the in-game leader tends to go, as the career of MSL has shown you in North. So, I actually think the really interesting detail here is if this works, well, then Existence has shown he can work with an international team. All of a sudden, the horizons are wide open, and as they were for the last few years, he will have offers from North America. He will have offers from international teams. The likes of perhaps a Mouse Sports type team might be a possibility. And obviously, when you see that he's burned through all of his bridges in the French scene and just no one really has faith in him anymore, this could be a very interesting final act to Existence's career, because as I've often mentioned, the main reason he didn't go international and was willing to even play in shit teams like LDLC is because this is a guy who, for some bizarre reason, has just decided he doesn't understand English. He doesn't speak English well enough. Now, he does, spoken to him numerous times, I've heard him speak numerous times, maybe on camera he's not as comfortable. He can absolutely speak English. He can speak English better than some players who have to speak English in international teams already, quite frankly. So I always thought that was an example of where, because he's good enough to be good/decent, he made the mistake of seeing all his flaws and not understanding he's much better than most people and the level you generally need. Now, I also will add the caveat. When you're someone known to be a very tactical in-game leader, you're going to want to be very eloquent and make sure you communicated your message correctly. So I understand it's different than being Carrigan playing in FaZe where you're doing things a little bit more loose. After Existence, I still think has got some legs in him as an in-game leader, although yes, I was very underwhelmed by the G2 performance just tactically, not in terms of results even. ScreaM is the next one. He's obviously the biggest name, the big marquee name here. He's still a guy who has talent. You saw flashes of that in Envious. You saw moments when he could be very good. It's still only a couple of years ago, he was an absolute monster in that G2 lineup with Shocks. The sad thing is, though, this is a guy who has the talent, but he's lost his identity. Like, for me, he needs to be not just a fragger, but he needs to be someone who has a comfortable mid-round / follow-up position within a round, so he has some say and some leeway as to when he goes in and how. Because he's someone where if you give him the freedom and the comfort to set up his shots, he's got some of the best aim we've ever seen. We all know that. His skill level is very high. But if you put him in uncomfortable situations or a role he doesn't like or a team that doesn't fit him, he will collapse on himself. And he is one of those guys, people overuse this cliche, so I don't use it that often myself, but he is an example of someone who is his own worst enemy. He shuts himself down. So when you consider he has a history with Existence back in the very games lineup that was very good in 2013, that was him playing some of his best Counter-Strike. He also obviously played some of his best Counter-Strike with Shocks in G2 in 2016, where we know he's again a very good individual player. The key thing with me is, I could see this working and I could see it not working. The reason I could see it working is, I actually think what hurt him in Envious is that he is open to being moulded. Because he's lost his identity, he's willing to listen to people's input as to what his role should be and how he should play. Now that could be very good if Existence looks at this team and realises ScreaM is one of the guys I have got to activate as a big time fragger and give him a lot of favourable opportunities. If he understands that, you could mould him and we could reinvent ScreaM to be a great player again. If, as in Envious, he lets people essentially kind of cock him into being a supportive element or playing a role that doesn't fit him, then I could see him being an absolute bust and this being, again, an underwhelming lineup for him where nothing really happens. This guy has to be one of your stars if this lineup's going to have success. After that, the other big name talent is obviously Draken. Now, this is another guy who clearly has talent. He clearly has mechanical abilities. You've seen him put up numbers in NIP. The problem is he hasn't really fit into a team or the overall style and identity of a team as an AWPer since Epsilon, which again, we're talking like 3 years ago, 2-3 years ago at this point in time. So I think Existence really has his work cut out with this guy because he's never managed to make it under the NIP lineups. He didn't manage to make it in Fnatic when he had Exist, and those guys were all telling me privately they fucking loved this guy and think he was going to be a great player for them. Nobody's made this guy work at the top level. So if Existence can do it, again, he will get a lot of props. He will be considered someone who helped turn around a seemingly bust guy in terms of being a talent. But the caveat I would give is, you could have said something similar about Twanu, who was in LDLC, a guy who was always a very streaky, not particularly good primary AWPer, and quite frankly was more famous for whiffing than hitting good AWP shots. So that wasn't very... I didn't think Existence did a great job with him, quite frankly. In fact, I think he actually bought into too much of Twanu's bullshit and gave him the things that he wanted in the game. So it's going to have to be different from that. Existence is going to have learned from his past mistakes. But if it can work, clearly Draken and ScreaM can be some big guns. They can be some heavy firepower, and especially, actually, for a no-name team with no org. They're much better talent than you'd expect from this kind of a composition of players. Now, the other two are a bit more questionable. So HS, the guy you remember from Penta and Optic, he's a guy who got overrated because he had little flashes of very good aim. And so he has some like an ace where he gets like all headshots. It looks sick, but if you watched a whole game of him, he wasn't doing that stuff most of the time. He also looked like someone who was a little bit lost in his role. I don't think he's had the great in-game leader that could really give him his role. So in theory, developing player, he's someone where let's see what Existence can do with him. Existence didn't do much with body, and after that didn't have any rookies. But I want to see, I saw him work at LDLC and bring through some of those players. If this is a player who can start to become good, can actually fit his role, can contribute and not be kind of an inexperienced player who just hasn't been at the top, then we can start to see. Because again, there's some flashes of talent here. I'm not going to write him off entirely. Attitude-wise, seems like a somewhat reasonable individual. You know, I don't see why that wouldn't work. The last player is Hampus, the Swede, a former in-game leader, so you'd hope he can perhaps aid Existence, that he's going to listen to the in-game leader. I'm hoping that he's going to be part of the team player call with Existence so we can have a proper squad in that respect, because I think he has to, if you look at the rest of the players, be the supportive element here. Clearly, the fragging is supposed to come from the others, but this is a guy, he's never been on a top level team. Hopefully, he sees this as his chance to help Existence mold the rest of the team, fill in the gaps that the squad aren't able to fill in, because obviously players like Draken and ScreaM are very flawed players and HS is too inexperienced. So if Hampus can be that kind of glue guy, then I think he could do a lot for this team. Now, the interesting thing about this lineup is, considering it is a no-name org, doesn't exist, players that are from all different regions don't really have any natural chemistry or connection with each other, except for the fact that, like, I mean, 2 of them are Swedish, 2 of them are Belgian. Okay, that's about it. I actually think it's actually not that bad a lineup. Like, you look at this team, there's a world in which if things come together and they can overcome cultural differences and communication issues, this is a team that could be top 20 in the world. This is a team that could be going to tier 2 events and competing with some of the better squads out there in terms of who attends the DreamHack Opens. Can they make it beyond that? Well, now you're asking for a lot of ifs to come true. Now you're asking for all the win conditions to be hit. Okay, I'm not going to go that far. That's too crazy. But as much as you need a lot of optimism, there are some like flashes of glimmers of hope or light here. Like, Existence and ScreaM are the main keys for me because they have been top players at their positions before. If they can work out, then what's great is this particular lineup doesn't even necessarily have to work out. You could get other players in. It's an international team. And if it works out, especially those players, Existence and ScreaM, if they're anywhere close to a good level, people will want to play with them. So that would open a lot of doors, both for them to go elsewhere to international lineups, but also to bring international players in and therefore potentially have a totally different like adventure in their careers compared to what they've done early on, which would be hoping to get back into a Vitaly or a G2, kind of ships that have sailed at this point in time. This video and all of the content on my channel is kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Andreas, Snazore Westerlund, Gardner Wilson, James Harding, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, NateDOhDoubleG, Travis Greb, Tristan Jones, and as always, a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to take part in an esports discussion with yours truly? Would you like teasers for some of my upcoming content? See who the guests are going to be? Do you want to ask me a question for my monthly video AMA? Perhaps you'd like to suggest a guest you'd like to see in my content or a topic to discuss. Well, if so, then put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.